In 1840, a 31-year-old self-educated printer from the French countryside published a book that would shake the foundations of political and economic thought. His name was Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, and with a single provocative declaration he launched a philosophical movement that would echo through the next 2 centuries. That declaration was simple but explosive: property is theft. Proudhon was not an agitator seeking chaos or destruction, though many would accuse him of precisely that. He was attempting something far more ambitious: to diagnose the deepest contradictions of modern society and propose a radical cure. Born in January of 1809 in Besançon, France, Proudhon emerged from genuine poverty. His father was a failed cooper and tavern keeper, and young Pierre worked as a cowherd in the Jura Mountains by age 9. He wore wooden shoes to school among the sons of merchants, experiencing firsthand the humiliation that class hierarchy inflicts upon the poor. But poverty did not crush his intellect, it sharpened it. Proudhon won a scholarship to college through sheer brilliance, taught himself Latin to better practice his trade as a printer, and consumed the works of philosophers, economists and political theorists with a hunger born of necessity. He would become the only major socialist theorist of the 19th century who actually came from the working class. What makes Proudhon historically significant is not just what he said, but when and how he said it. He was the first person in history to publicly declare himself an anarchist, transforming what had been a term of insult into a coherent political philosophy. Before Proudhon, anarchism meant chaos and disorder. After Proudhon, it meant something entirely different: a vision of society organized without government, where order emerges not from coercion but from voluntary cooperation and mutual respect. His influence is difficult to overstate. He shaped the thinking of Mikhail Bakunin, Peter Kropotkin, and countless labor activists across Europe. His ideas sparked fierce debates with Karl Marx that would eventually split the socialist movement into 2 competing camps: Marxism and Anarchism. Workers in Paris adopted his theories of mutualism and tried to implement them during the revolutionary upheavals of 1848. His vision of federalism influenced political movements from Spain to Russia. Yet Proudhon remains one of the most misunderstood thinkers in political history. His famous slogan, "Property is theft," is regularly quoted but rarely comprehended in its full complexity. Critics on the right dismissed him as a dangerous revolutionary. Critics on the left, including Marx, accused him of being a bourgeois reformist in anarchist clothing. Some later movements tried to claim him for fascism, others for libertarian capitalism, both wildly misreading his actual positions. The truth is that Proudhon defies easy categorization. He rejected both capitalism and state socialism. He opposed private property but also rejected communism. He advocated revolution but insisted it must be peaceful. He championed individual freedom but argued humans are fundamentally social beings. These apparent contradictions are not signs of confused thinking. They are the deliberate products of a philosophical method that sought to transcend false dichotomies. This exploration will take you deep into Proudhon's intellectual world. We will examine not just what he believed, but why he believed it, how he reasoned through economic and political problems, where his ideas succeeded and where they failed. We will look at the philosophical foundations of his thinking, his specific proposals for reorganizing society, his bitter conflicts with other socialist thinkers, and the lasting impact of his work. Understanding Proudhon means grappling with fundamental questions about human nature, economic justice, political authority, and social organization. It means confronting the tension between liberty and order, between individual rights and collective welfare, between revolutionary change and peaceful transformation. These questions remain urgent today, perhaps more urgent than ever. Part 1. The Birth of a Philosophy. To understand Proudhon's revolutionary ideas, we must first understand the world that produced them. 19th century France was a society in violent transformation. The old feudal order had been shattered by the Revolution of 1789, but what would replace it remained bitterly contested. When Proudhon came of age in the 1820s and 30s, France oscillated between monarchy, republic, and empire. The Industrial Revolution was beginning to reshape the economy, drawing peasants into factories and creating a new urban working class. Traditional craftsmen, the skilled artisans who had formed the backbone of medieval production, found themselves threatened by mechanization and factory competition. Wealth was concentrating in the hands of a new capitalist class, while workers lived in conditions of appalling poverty. This was the crucible that forged Proudhon's thinking. Unlike the salon socialists who theorized about workers from comfortable distance, Proudhon knew poverty intimately. He had lived it, breathed it, felt its weight on his shoulders as a child in wooden shoes. When he looked at the emerging industrial economy, he saw not progress, but a new form of exploitation, replacing the old. In 1840, Proudhon published his first major work, What is Property?, or an inquiry into the principle of right and government. The book opens with a declaration that would make him instantly famous and notorious. Property is theft. Now, this statement requires immediate clarification, because Proudhon did not mean what most people assume. He was not saying that all ownership is illegitimate, or that people should not control any resources. His argument was far more sophisticated and targeted a specific phenomenon that he believed corrupted society at its core. Proudhon drew a crucial distinction between two types of ownership that the French language and most economic theories conflated under the single term property. The first he called possession, the second property in its strict sense. Possession, in Proudhon's framework, refers to the legitimate use of resources that you actually occupy and utilize. If you live in a house, work a farm, or use tools in your trade, you possess these things. Your possession is justified by your use, by the fact that these resources are necessary for your life and livelihood. Proudhon had no problem with possession. In fact, he vigorously defended it. Property, on the other hand, meant something different and more sinister in his analysis. Property referred to the legal right to exclude others from resources and to extract income from those resources without actually using them yourself. It meant the right of a landlord to collect rent while living elsewhere, the right of a capitalist to profit from a factory without working in it, the right of a financier to collect interest on loans. This form of property allowed some people to live parasitically off the labour of others. When Proudhon declared property as theft, he meant this second form specifically. The landlord who collects rent is stealing a portion of the tenant's labour. The factory owner who pays workers' wages and keeps the profits is stealing the surplus value that the workers collectively create. The banker who charges interest is stealing from the borrower. In each case, someone who contributes no actual labour extracts wealth from those who do. This might sound like Marxist theory, and there are indeed similarities, but Proudhon arrived at these conclusions independently, and his reasoning took a different path. For Proudhon, the problem was fundamentally about justice and natural right, not historical materialism. He argued that labour is the only legitimate source of ownership. If you work something, if you transform it with your effort, then you have a just claim to its use. But the moment you claim ownership beyond what you actually use and work, you are committing an injustice. Think of it this way. A farmer who works 50 acres with his family has a legitimate possession of that land because he uses it productively. But a landlord who owns 5,000 acres and rents plots to tenants is not using that land himself. He is merely extracting payment from those who do use it. His legal title gives him power to appropriate the fruits of other people's labour without contributing any labour of his own. This, Proudhon argued, is fundamentally theft disguised by law. The implications of this analysis were radical. Proudhon was attacking the very foundation of the capitalist economy and the legal structures that supported it. Rent, profit and interest, the three forms of unearned income that capitalism treats as natural and legitimate, were, in his view, simply institutionalized theft. The entire system of wage labour, where workers sell their time and effort to employers who own the means of production, was a massive engine of exploitation. But here is where Proudhon's thought becomes more complex and more interesting. Unlike communists, he did not propose abolishing all private ownership and making everything collective property. In fact, he vigorously opposed such schemes as a different kind of tyranny. If the state owns everything, he argued, then individuals become utterly dependent on state power and lose their autonomy. Collective ownership enforced by state authority simply replaces one form of exploitation with another. Proudhon's alternative was possession without property. Each person or family should possess the resources they actually use, their home, their tools, their workshop, their farm. But no one should own resources they do not personally utilize. Factories would not be owned by capitalists but possessed collectively by the workers who operate them, forming what Proudhon called labour associations. These would be cooperatives running on directly democratic principles, where the workers themselves make decisions and share the fruits of their collective labour. This brings us to the heart of Proudhon's positive philosophy, his theory of mutualism. The term mutualism itself came from French workers, particularly silk workers in Lyon, whom Proudhon encountered in the 1840s. These craftsmen had developed their own theories of mutual aid and reciprocal exchange, and Proudhon adopted and systematized their insights into a comprehensive economic theory. Mutualism rests on a simple but powerful principle. Economic exchange should be based on reciprocity and mutual benefit, not exploitation. In a mutualist system, self-employed artisans, peasant farmers, and worker cooperatives would trade with each other on the basis of labour time. If a shoemaker spends 10 hours making a pair of boots, and a carpenter spends 10 hours making a chair, these products should exchange equally because equal labour has been invested. Now, this might sound naive, and indeed Marx would later savage this aspect of Proudhon's thinking. But Proudhon was not as simple-minded as his critics sometimes suggest. He understood that different types of labour have different levels of skill, and that market forces would necessarily play a role in determining exchange values. His point was that the exchange should reflect the actual labour contributed, not be distorted by the monopolistic power that property rights confer. The genius of Proudhon's mutualism lies in how it attempts to thread the needle between individualism and collectivism. He wanted to preserve individual autonomy and freedom, the ability of people to control their own work and make their own decisions. But he also recognized that humans are social beings who depend on cooperation and that modern production requires coordination on a large scale. Mutualism tries to achieve collective coordination through voluntary association rather than through either capitalist employment or state direction. Central to this vision was Proudhon's proposal for a people's bank or bank of exchange. This institution would provide interest-free credit to workers and producers, charging only a minimal administrative fee. The logic here is crucial to understand. Under capitalism, those who already have capital can lend it at interest, making money simply by having money. This gives enormous power to the wealthy and forces workers and small producers to pay tribute to capital simply to access the tools and resources they need for production. Proudhon argued that interest on loans is unjustifiable, that it represents payment for nothing. When a bank lends money, it is not really giving up anything. It is creating credit that will be repaid. The borrower pays back the principal plus interest, meaning the lender profits without contributing any labour or taking any real risk once the loan is properly secured. By eliminating interest, Proudhon believed he could break the power of finance capital and allow workers to access productive resources on equitable terms. In 1849, Proudhon actually tried to create such a bank in practice. He sought funding through voluntary subscriptions and attempted to operationalize his theories of mutual credit. The experiment failed, partly because it was undercapitalized, partly because Proudhon himself was arrested for seditious writing and imprisoned for 3 years. But the failure was also instructive. It revealed some of the practical difficulties in Proudhon's schemes, difficulties that would become more apparent over time. The other pillar of Proudhon's philosophy was his critique of the state. When he declared himself an anarchist in what is property, he was claiming that government itself is illegitimate, that political authority represents domination and should be abolished. This was not a call for chaos or disorder, quite the opposite. In his work, The Confessions of a Revolutionary, published in 1849, Proudhon wrote his most famous formulation, "Anarchy is order without power." This seemingly paradoxical statement captures the core of anarchist philosophy. Order does not require hierarchy or coercion. People can organize themselves voluntarily through mutual agreements and associations. What prevents order is not the absence of government, but the presence of exploitation and domination. Proudhon argued that the state exists primarily to protect property, meaning the exploitative form of ownership he had critiqued. Laws are made and enforced to secure the rights of landlords, capitalists and creditors against workers and the poor. Police and military force exist to suppress resistance to exploitation. The entire apparatus of government, from legislatures to courts to bureaucracies, serves to maintain and legitimize a fundamentally unjust economic system. But Proudhon was not advocating the violent overthrow of government. This is a crucial point that distinguishes him from later revolutionary anarchists. Proudhon believed that social transformation could and should occur peacefully through economic reorganization. As workers form cooperatives, established mutual credit systems, and built federations of free communes, the state would simply become irrelevant. Deprived of its economic base, deprived of the support of productive society, government would wither away naturally. Instead of the state, Proudhon proposed a federative system. Society would organize itself from the bottom up through voluntary associations. At the base would be communes, local communities governing their own affairs through direct democracy. These communes would federate together for purposes that require larger-scale coordination, always maintaining their autonomy and always with the right to withdraw from any federation. No central authority would have power over the parts. Everything would operate through contracts freely entered into and maintained through mutual respect. Part 2. The Dialectical Method and Economic Contradictions. To truly understand Proudhon's philosophy, we must examine not just what he concluded, but how he thought, the intellectual method he employed to reach his conclusions. In 1846, Proudhon published his most ambitious theoretical work, The System of Economic Contradictions, or The Philosophy of Poverty. This two-volume treatise attempted nothing less than a complete reconstruction of economic science based on a dialectical analysis of capitalism's internal tensions. Proudhon had been profoundly influenced by the German philosopher Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, though he encountered Hegel's ideas second-hand through French interpreters and never mastered German. From Hegel, Proudhon adopted the dialectical method, the idea that truth emerges through the clash and synthesis of opposing forces. But Proudhon applied this method in his own distinctive way, focusing on economic rather than purely philosophical categories. The dialectical approach starts with a simple recognition. Reality is full of contradictions, opposing forces that generate conflict and motion. These contradictions are not mere logical errors to be resolved, they are the actual structure of how things work. A thesis generates its antithesis, and from their conflict emerges a synthesis that contains and transcends both. For Proudhon, political economy, meaning the study of how societies produce and distribute goods, was riddled with such contradictions. Every economic institution, every principle that economists claimed was natural or necessary, contained within itself an opposing principle that undermined it. These were not abstract philosophical games, they were real tensions that manifested in social misery, economic crises, and class conflict. Take the division of labour, one of the foundations of modern industrial production. Adam Smith had famously praised the division of labour for its efficiency. By breaking complex tasks into simple, repetitive operations, each performed by a specialized worker, production could be vastly increased. Smith's example of the pin factory showed how 10 workers, each performing one small task, could produce thousands of times more pins than 10 workers each, making complete pins from start to finish. Proudhon acknowledged this productive power. The division of labour was indeed a great advance, an economic force multiplier that made modern industrial output possible. But, and here is the dialectical turn, the division of labour also contained its own negation, its own destructive principle. When work is divided into narrow, repetitive tasks, the worker becomes a mere appendage of the production process, a human cog in an industrial machine. The craftsman who once made complete products, who exercised skill and judgment and creativity, is reduced to performing the same monotonous operation hour after hour, day after day. His knowledge atrophies, his skills narrow, his humanity is diminished. He becomes what Marx would later call alienated, separated from the full meaning and product of his labour. Moreover, the division of labour creates dependence. The worker who performs only one small task cannot survive independently. He needs the entire productive apparatus, and thus becomes dependent on whoever controls that apparatus. The capitalist who owns the factory gains enormous power over workers precisely because the division of labour has made them incapable of independent production. So the very thing that increases productivity also increases exploitation and domination. This is economic contradiction in Proudhon's sense. Division of labour is both productive force and source of oppression. You cannot simply reject it and return to artisan production. That would mean abandoning the material abundance that division of labour makes possible. But you cannot simply embrace it either, because it degrades human beings and concentrates power. The contradiction must be resolved at a higher level through a new form of organisation that preserves the productive power while eliminating the domination. Proudhon applied this dialectical analysis to every major category of political economy. Machinery presents a similar contradiction. Machines multiply productive power and reduce the burden of physical toil, which seems purely beneficial. But under capitalism, machinery becomes a weapon against workers. Machines replace human labour, creating unemployment. They de-skill work, reducing wages. They allow capitalists to work fewer, more controllable employees. The worker finds himself in competition with machines, forced to accept worse conditions or be replaced entirely. Competition itself embodies contradiction. Free competition, the cornerstone of liberal economic theory, supposedly ensures efficiency and consumer benefit. When producers compete, they must innovate, reduce costs, and serve customers better to survive. This competitive pressure drives economic progress. But competition also produces monopoly. The most successful competitors destroy or absorb their rivals, concentrating economic power in fewer and fewer hands. Competition thus negates itself, transforming into its opposite. Credit and money contain contradictions. Credit allows productive investment that would otherwise be impossible, enabling entrepreneurs to start businesses and farmers to plant crops. But credit also enables usury, the extraction of interest by those who already have wealth from those who need it. Money serves as a universal medium of exchange, facilitating complex economic coordination. But money also becomes an object of hoarding and speculation, a source of power divorced from actual production. Even value itself, the most fundamental economic category, is contradictory in Proudhon's analysis. A commodity has use value, its practical utility, and exchange value, what it trades for in the market. These two forms of value often conflict. Something extremely useful like water might have low exchange value because it is abundant, while something less essential like diamonds has high exchange value because of scarcity. Labour creates use value, but exchange value depends on market forces beyond any worker's control. Now, Proudhon's dialectical method led him to a crucial conclusion about capitalism as a system. Every principle of bourgeois political economy contains its own refutation. Every institution of the capitalist economy generates contradictions that produce crisis and suffering. These contradictions cannot be resolved through piecemeal reform or through trusting market forces to eventually balance things out. The contradictions are structural, built into the system itself. But here is where Proudhon's approach differed fundamentally from what Marx would later develop. For Marx, contradictions in capitalism would eventually become so acute that the system would collapse in revolutionary crisis, giving way to socialism. The proletariat, driven to desperation by worsening conditions and united by the factory system, would overthrow the bourgeoisie and seize the means of production. Proudhon rejected this revolutionary catastrophism. He did not believe contradictions would automatically resolve themselves through violent upheaval. Instead, he thought contradictions had to be consciously transcended through the creation of new economic forms that synthesized the positive aspects of existing institutions while eliminating their negative aspects. This synthesis would be achieved through mutualism. Consider property again through this dialectical lens. Private property in the capitalist sense enables exploitation and creates inequality. This is the negative moment, the antithesis. But collective property enforced by the state also has negative aspects. It destroys individual autonomy and creates a new form of domination. The synthesis, Proudhon argued, is possession, a form of ownership based on use and occupation that preserves individual control without enabling exploitation. Similarly, with economic coordination, free markets allow flexibility and respond to changing needs, but they also produce chaos, crisis, and inequality. Central planning can coordinate production, but it requires a powerful state and destroys initiative. The mutualist synthesis is federative association, voluntary cooperation among independent producers who coordinate through contracts and mutual banks rather than through either market competition or state command. Proudhon spent hundreds of pages in the System of Economic Contradictions working through these dialectical analyses, examining how every economic category contains opposing principles that must be synthesized. The work is dense, sometimes repetitious, and often obscure in its reasoning. Even sympathetic readers have found it difficult to follow. This brings us to a critical weakness in Proudhon's dialectical method, one that Marx would exploit mercilessly in his response. Proudhon treated economic categories as if they were independent forces with their own logic, rather than as human creations that emerge from specific historical conditions. He wrote as if competition, machinery, credit, and so forth were eternal principles that could be analyzed in the abstract, separate from the social relations that actually produce them. Marx argued this was a fundamental error, a retreat into idealism that missed the materialist core of economic analysis. Economic categories are not timeless abstractions. They are expressions of real social relationships between people in specific historical circumstances. Private property does not exist because of some logical principle. It exists because certain groups of people have seized resources and used force to exclude others. Wage labour is not a natural category. It emerged historically when peasants were driven off the land and forced to sell their labour power to survive. By treating economic categories as abstract principles to be dialectically analysed, Proudhon lost sight of the actual class struggles and historical developments that create and change economic systems. His method became a kind of logical exercise that could generate clever syntheses on paper, but lacked connection to the real forces driving social change. Moreover, Proudhon's faith in peaceful synthesis through mutual credit and voluntary association underestimated the resistance that privileged classes would mount to any transformation that threatened their power. He imagined that workers could simply create alternative institutions, cooperatives, and mutual banks, and these would gradually outcompete capitalist enterprises. But he did not adequately address how capitalists would use their control of the state, the legal system, and economic resources to crush such alternatives. The Bank of the People's failure illustrated this problem concretely. Proudhon could not raise sufficient capital through voluntary subscriptions because workers lacked the resources to subscribe in meaningful amounts. The wealthy who did have resources had no incentive to fund an institution designed to undermine their economic power. And the state, far from being neutral, actively repressed Proudhon's efforts, imprisoning him and shutting down his publications. Yet, despite these weaknesses, Proudhon's dialectical analysis contained genuine insights that remain valuable. He was correct that capitalism contains deep structural contradictions that cannot be resolved within the system itself. The tension between productive cooperation and individual appropriation, between social production and private ownership, between the promise of technology and its use as a tool of domination, these are real problems that persist to this day. Proudhon was also ahead of his time in recognizing that socialism must somehow synthesize individual freedom and collective coordination. The crude opposition between private property and state ownership, between market and plan, between individualism and collectivism, this binary thinking has plagued socialist theory for over a century. Proudhon's insistence on seeking a third way, however imperfect his specific proposals, pointed toward questions that socialists still struggle with. His emphasis on federalism and voluntary association as alternatives to both capitalist markets and state socialism would influence anarchist and syndicalist movements for generations. The idea that workers could organize production through democratic cooperatives, coordinated through federations rather than through markets or central planning, became a core anarchist principle. While Proudhon's specific mechanisms, like labour time vouchers and mutual credit, proved impractical, the underlying vision of worker self-management remains relevant. The system of economic contradictions represents Proudhon at his most ambitious and also at his most vulnerable to criticism. It shows both his brilliance in identifying real problems with capitalism and his limitations in proposing workable solutions. Marx's devastating response, The Poverty of Philosophy, would expose many of these limitations and set the stage for the great split between anarchist and Marxist socialism. Part 3. The Federative Principle. If Proudhon's economic analysis told people what to abolish, his federative principle told them what to build in its place. This positive vision of how society could organize itself without government or capitalism represents perhaps his most enduring contribution to political thought. The word federalism today suggests a form of government, like the United States system where power is divided between federal and state levels. But Proudhon meant something far more radical. He envisioned federalism without government, a society organized through voluntary contracts between free individuals and free associations, with no sovereign power standing above the parts. Start with the smallest unit, the individual worker or producer. In Proudhon's vision, each person possesses the tools and resources necessary for their work. A shoemaker has his workshop and tools, a farmer has his land and equipment, a writer has his library and desk. These possessions are secure because they are based on use, not on abstract legal titles that allow absentee ownership. But individuals do not work in isolation. Human production is inherently social. The shoemaker needs leather from the tanner, thread from the spinner, food from the farmer. Complex goods like machinery require the coordinated effort of many workers with different skills. Modern production, Proudhon recognized, demands large-scale cooperation. So individuals form associations, voluntary groupings for mutual benefit. Workers in a factory would form a labour association, what we might call a worker cooperative today. Instead of being employed by a capitalist who owns the factory and appropriates the profits, the workers themselves collectively possess the factory and make decisions democratically. They elect managers who serve at their pleasure. They decide what to produce and how to organize work. They share the proceeds according to principles they establish. These labour associations would be truly democratic in their internal structure, one worker, one vote. Important decisions would be made in general assemblies where everyone has voice and equal say. Day-to-day operations might be delegated to elected managers or committees, but these would always remain accountable to the membership and subject to recall. The principle is simple. Those who do the work control the work. Now, these individual associations need to coordinate with each other. The textile cooperative needs cotton from agricultural cooperatives, machines from metalworking cooperatives, transport from shipping cooperatives. In capitalism, this coordination happens through markets and prices, with capitalists making investment decisions based on profit calculations. In state socialism, it happens through central planning, with bureaucrats making production decisions based on state directives. Proudhon rejected both models. Markets, he believed, inevitably produce inequality and instability. Central planning requires a powerful state that inevitably becomes oppressive. His alternative was coordination through contract and federation. Associations would negotiate contracts with each other, voluntary agreements specifying what each will provide and what each will receive in exchange. A textile cooperative might contract with a cotton farming cooperative to supply a certain quantity of cotton in exchange for a certain quantity of cloth. These contracts would be bilateral, meaning both parties must agree, and they would be limited in duration, renewable or renegotiable at regular intervals. The contracts would be enforced not by state power but by mutual interest and reputation. If one cooperative fails to honour its agreements, other cooperatives will refuse to deal with it in the future. The logic is the same as any business relationship. Trust must be earned and maintained. But without the power imbalance created by private property and wage labour, contracts would be genuinely voluntary and mutually beneficial rather than coercive. At a larger scale, cooperatives would federate, forming regional and industrial federations for purposes that require broader coordination. All the textile cooperatives in a region might form a federation to share information about techniques, coordinate production to avoid duplication, and negotiate collectively with supplier federations. But, and this is crucial, the federation would have no power over its members. Each cooperative remains autonomous, free to leave the federation if it finds the arrangement unsatisfactory. The same federative principle applies to geographic communities. Proudhon envisioned communes, local communities organized as self-governing entities. A commune might be a village, a neighborhood in a city, or a district based on whatever makes sense for local conditions. The commune would manage common resources, coordinate local production and consumption, maintain infrastructure, and handle conflicts among residents. But communes would not be sovereign states with coercive power over individuals. The relationship between individual and commune, like all relationships in Proudhon's system, would be contractual. Individuals belong to the commune by choice and can leave if they wish. The commune exercises authority only over matters that members have agreed to delegate to it. Everything operates on the basis of voluntary association and mutual agreement. Communes themselves would federate for larger purposes. Several communes might form a regional federation to manage a river system, coordinate road networks, or operate industries that require scale. These regional federations might in turn federate at even larger scales, national or international, for purposes like scientific research, large infrastructure projects, or mutual defense. But at every level, the same principle holds: the parts are primary and the federation is secondary. Power flows from bottom to top, not top to bottom. No federation can impose its will on its members. Every level of organization exists only to facilitate coordination that benefits the constituent parts, and when it fails to serve that purpose, it can be dissolved or reformed. This stands in stark contrast to the state, which claims sovereignty, meaning ultimate authority that cannot be challenged by its subjects. The state imposes laws backed by force, collects taxes whether people consent or not, and maintains a monopoly on legitimate violence through police and military. Citizens cannot simply opt out of the state. They are subject to its power, whether they agree with its actions or not. Proudhon's federalism eliminates sovereignty entirely. There is no ultimate authority, no power that can impose its will unilaterally. All authority is delegated, limited, revocable, and based on voluntary agreement. The system is anarchistic, without rulers, but it is not chaotic. It is ordered through voluntary cooperation and mutual respect. To make this concrete, imagine how dispute resolution would work in such a system. If two cooperatives have a disagreement about a contract, they would negotiate. If they cannot resolve it themselves, they might agree to arbitration by a mutually chosen third party. But the arbitrator has no power to enforce a decision. Both parties must agree to abide by the arbitration for it to have effect. This might seem like it would produce endless conflict, but Proudhon argued the opposite. When both parties know that they must agree, that neither can simply impose its will, they have strong incentive to find mutually acceptable solutions. Reputation matters enormously. A cooperative known for bad faith negotiation will find itself isolated. The system creates pressure toward fair dealing without requiring coercive enforcement. Central to making this work was Proudhon's proposed People's Bank and system of mutual credit. Without access to capital, workers cannot form cooperatives or compete with established capitalist enterprises. Traditional banks lend only to those who already have collateral and charge interest that extracts wealth from borrowers. This maintains the dominance of capital over labour. The People's Bank would operate on different principles entirely. It would be owned by its members, the workers, and cooperatives who use its services. Instead of charging interest, it would charge only a minimal administrative fee to cover operating costs. Credit would be extended based on the productive capacity and trustworthiness of the borrower, not on existing collateral. The bank would create credit backed by the collective productivity of all its members. This is complex, so let me explain the logic more carefully. Money in modern economies is largely credit, promises to pay that circulate as if they were actual wealth. Banks create credit when they make loans, expanding the money supply. Proudhon argued that this credit creation should serve the producers rather than enrich bankers through interest. When a cooperative needs funds to purchase equipment, it would approach the mutual bank. The bank would assess whether the equipment would enhance the cooperative's productivity and whether the cooperative has shown itself reliable. If both conditions are met, the bank extends credit. The cooperative uses this credit to purchase equipment, then repays the bank from increased production. No interest is charged, so the full benefit of increased productivity goes to the workers, rather than being siphoned off by financiers. This system, Proudhon believed, would allow workers to gradually acquire productive resources and form cooperatives without having to accumulate capital through exploitation. As more workers formed cooperatives and joined the mutual credit system, capitalist enterprises would find themselves unable to compete. Why would workers accept wage employment when they could work in a cooperative where they control the process and keep the full fruits of their labor? The transformation would thus occur peacefully through economic competition rather than political revolution. Capitalists could not use state power to suppress cooperatives because the state would become increasingly irrelevant as economic power shifted. Workers engaged in mutual aid and running their own enterprises would have no need for government. The state apparatus, deprived of its economic base, would simply wither away. Now, this vision contains elements of brilliance and elements of naivety in roughly equal measure. The brilliance lies in Proudhon's recognition that democracy must extend into economic life, that political freedom without economic freedom is hollow. He understood that wage labour is a form of subordination, that workers need not just voting rights, but control over their work itself. The Federative Principle, the idea of building social organisation from the bottom up through voluntary association, offers a genuine alternative to both capitalist markets and state bureaucracy. Modern experiments with worker cooperatives, mutual aid societies, and decentralised decision-making often echo Proudhon's vision. The cooperative movement that emerged in the late 19th century drew heavily on his ideas. But the naivety lies in Proudhon's underestimation of power and his overestimation of voluntary cooperation. He assumed that capitalists would simply accept being outcompeted and that the state would passively allow itself to be made redundant. History has shown otherwise. Ruling classes do not relinquish power voluntarily. They use every tool at their disposal, legal and illegal, violent and subtle, to maintain dominance. Worker cooperatives in capitalist economies face enormous disadvantages. They cannot easily access credit from conventional banks, which view cooperative ownership as risky. They struggle to compete with capitalist firms that can externalize costs onto workers and communities. They often degenerate into conventional businesses as successful cooperatives hire wage laborers to expand, recreating the capital-labor divide they meant to transcend. The mutual bank, Proudhon's key mechanism for transformation, proved impractical. Creating credit requires either existing wealth to back it or state power to enforce acceptance of the credit. Proudhon had neither A mutual bank, competing with state-backed conventional banks, without accumulated capital or legal enforcement power, cannot function at the scale necessary to transform an entire economy. More fundamentally, Proudhon's federative vision assumes a level of good faith and rationality that human societies rarely display. He imagined that people and associations would honour contracts and maintain reputations because it served their long-term interest. But humans are often short-sighted, driven by immediate advantage rather than future reputation. Without some mechanism of enforcement, without some recourse when good faith is violated, cooperative systems become vulnerable to free riders and bad actors. This is the classic problem of anarchist organization: how to maintain order and enforce agreements without creating coercive authority. Proudhon's answer, mutual interest and reputation, works to some degree in small-scale communities where everyone knows everyone, and future interactions are certain. But in large, complex societies with mobile populations and impersonal relationships, reputation is less effective, and mutual interest becomes harder to calculate. Despite these problems, Proudhon's federative principle remains intellectually fertile. His insistence that authority must always flow from bottom to top, that larger organizations exist only to serve their constituent parts, offers a powerful critique of both state socialism and corporate capitalism. His vision of economic democracy, of workers controlling their workplaces through democratic cooperatives, anticipates much later developments in industrial democracy and participatory economics. The principle that relationships should be based on voluntary contract rather than imposed hierarchy continues to inspire movements for decentralization and direct democracy. From the Paris Commune to Spanish anarchism to modern platform cooperatives, experiments in federative organization keep recurring because the underlying insight is sound. People can cooperate voluntarily to achieve common purposes without submitting to sovereign authority. What Proudhon lacked was not vision, but a realistic account of how to get from here to there, how to build federative society in a world dominated by states and capitals that will resist such transformation with all their considerable power. This pragmatic weakness would prove decisive in the conflicts to come. Part 4. The Great Split with Marx. Few intellectual feuds in history have been more consequential than the clash between Pierre-Joseph Proudhon and Karl Marx. Their conflict was not mere personal animosity, though personal factors certainly played a role. It represented a fundamental split in the socialist movement, a division between two incompatible visions of how to analyze capitalism and how to overcome it. That split would define the boundary between anarchism and Marxism for the next century and a half. The story begins with mutual admiration. In 1844, Marx arrived in Paris after being exiled from Germany for his radical journalism. He encountered Proudhon, who by then had achieved fame through What is Property, and was the most prominent socialist thinker in France. The two men met, talked through long nights, and exchanged ideas. Marx was impressed by Proudhon's comprehensive critique of property and his willingness to make bold connections. Marx, at this time, was still developing his own theories. He had absorbed German philosophy, particularly Hegel and Ludwig Feuerbach, and was beginning to apply philosophical analysis to political economy. In his early work, The Holy Family, written in 1845, Marx actually praised Proudhon lavishly. He called Proudhon's work a scientific manifesto of the proletariat and identified Proudhon himself as genuinely proletarian, not a bourgeois intellectual theorizing from outside the working class. Marx saw Proudhon's great contribution as demonstrating that private property should be abolished entirely, not merely reformed. This insight, Marx believed, showed the revolutionary potential of proletarian thought. Here was a worker, self-educated, thinking through the fundamental contradictions of capitalism and arriving at radical conclusions through his own analysis. But Marx also noted weaknesses in Proudhon's early work. Even in The Holy Family, while praising Proudhon, Marx suggested that Proudhon did not fully grasp the nature of wages and money, that he treated these as independent things rather than as expressions of underlying social relations. This criticism hinted at the deeper theoretical differences that would soon explode into open conflict. The break came in 1846 and 47. Marx was trying to organize a communist correspondence committee to unite socialists across Europe around a common theoretical framework. He wrote to Proudhon inviting him to participate. In this letter, Marx laid out his vision, a disciplined organization of revolutionaries who would combat utopian socialism and establish scientific socialism on rigorous theoretical foundations. Proudhon's response was polite but firm in its rejection. He wrote that he had no use for revolutionary action as a means of social reform, calling such action an appeal to force and arbitrariness. He believed change should come through peaceful evolution, through workers organizing themselves economically rather than seizing state power politically. Proudhon told Marx directly that they fundamentally disagreed about method and means. Shortly after this exchange, in late 1846, Proudhon published his major work, The System of Economic Contradictions, or The Philosophy of Poverty. He sent a copy to Marx asking for feedback. What he got was not feedback, but a full-scale assault. Marx spent the early months of 1847 writing his response, which he published in July of that year under the deliberately mocking title, The Poverty of Philosophy. Answer to the Philosophy of Poverty by Mr. Proudhon. The book was written in French to ensure French workers would understand Marx's attack. The play on words in the title, transforming Proudhon's philosophy of poverty into poverty of philosophy, set the contemptuous tone. Marx's critique operated on multiple levels simultaneously. First, he attacked Proudhon's intellectual competence, accusing him of being a mere sophist who used fancy rhetoric to cover up sloppy thinking. Marx claimed that Proudhon had failed to understand the economists he cited, that he attributed to himself discoveries that others had already made, and that he constructed elaborate arguments on foundations of confusion. Second, Marx attacked Proudhon's use of Hegelian dialectics. Proudhon, Marx argued, had adopted the worst aspects of Hegel's method while missing its revolutionary core. Proudhon treated economic categories like property, competition, machinery, credit as eternal abstractions that could be analyzed philosophically. He then tried to find contradictions within these abstract categories and resolve them through dialectical synthesis. But this entire approach, Marx insisted, was idealist and ahistorical. Economic categories are not timeless abstractions. They are expressions of real social relations that emerge under specific historical conditions. Private property does not exist because of logical necessity. It exists because of historical processes of appropriation and exclusion. Wage labour is not a natural category to be dialectically analysed. It is a social relationship created when producers are separated from the means of production. Marx drove this point home with devastating examples. Proudhon treated labour as if it had a fixed value, as if the value of a commodity could be determined simply by the amount of labour time invested in producing it. On this basis, Proudhon argued that exchanges should occur based on equal labour time, with products exchanging according to the labour embodied in them. This, Proudhon claimed, would eliminate exploitation. Marx showed that this was nonsense. In capitalism, labour itself is a commodity. Workers sell their capacity to work, their labour power, in exchange for wages. The value of labour power, like any commodity, is determined by the labour time necessary to produce it, which means the labour time necessary to produce the workers' means of subsistence. But the labour power that capitalists purchase can produce more value in a day than it costs to maintain the worker for that day. This surplus value is the source of profit. By failing to distinguish between labour and labour power, by failing to understand how labour becomes a commodity under capitalism, Proudhon missed the actual mechanism of exploitation. His schemes for equal exchange based on labour time could not eliminate exploitation because they did not address the fundamental problem that workers are forced to sell their labour power because they have been separated from the means of production. Marx also attacked Proudhon's economic analysis as fundamentally conservative despite its radical pretensions. Proudhon wanted to preserve the positive aspects of capitalism while eliminating the negative ones, keeping markets but eliminating profit, maintaining individual producers but achieving collective coordination. This was utopian fantasy, Marx argued. The positive and negative aspects of capitalism cannot be separated because they are two sides of the same coin. Competition does drive innovation, but it also drives the concentration of capital and the immiseration of workers. These are not separate principles that can be kept or discarded independently. They are inseparable aspects of how competition actually functions. Private property does enable individual initiative, but it also enables exploitation, and you cannot have one without the other. Proudhon's dream of synthesizing the good aspects while eliminating the bad was, in Marx's view, incoherent. Third, Marx attacked Proudhon politically. Proudhon's opposition to political action, his insistence that workers should focus on economic organization and avoid engaging with the state, was in Marx's view a recipe for impotence. The ruling class controls the state and uses state power to maintain its dominance. Workers cannot simply opt out of politics and build alternative institutions. They must confront and overthrow the existing power structure. Particularly devastating was Marx's criticism of Proudhon's position on strikes. Proudhon had written that strikes were counterproductive, because any wage increase would simply lead to price increases, leaving workers no better off. Marx pointed out that this completely misunderstood the dynamics of class struggle. Strikes are not just about wages, they are how workers develop organization, solidarity and class consciousness. Through struggle against employers, workers learn to act collectively and recognize their common interests. By opposing strikes and political action, Proudhon was effectively counseling workers to submit to exploitation while they gradually built cooperatives and mutual banks. But capitalists would not passively allow such alternatives to grow. They would use every means at their disposal to suppress them. Peaceful transformation was a pipe dream. Revolution would require confronting and defeating the capitalist class. Now we must be honest about the tone and fairness of Marx's critique. The poverty of philosophy was not a measured academic analysis. It was a polemical assault designed to destroy Proudhon's reputation and influence. Marx misrepresented some of Proudhon's positions, quoted him selectively, and attributed to him views he did not actually hold. The book's brilliance as polemic came at the cost of fairness. Marx was also motivated by factors beyond pure intellectual disagreement. He was jealous of Proudhon's influence among French workers, influence that Marx wanted for himself and his Communist Correspondence Committee. He was angry that Proudhon had rejected his invitation to join the committee. There is evidence that Marx's hostility was amplified by his dislike of Karl Grun, a German socialist who was translating Proudhon's work and whom Proudhon had defended. Some scholars, including the historian Edmund Wilson, have suggested that the poverty of philosophy was as much about Marx settling personal scores and establishing his own intellectual dominance as it was about genuine theoretical disagreement. The ferocity of the attack suggests wounded pride as much as intellectual conviction. But personal motivations do not negate the substance of Marx's critiques, many of which were valid. Proudhon did treat economic categories in an abstract ahistorical way that obscured the real social relations underlying them. He did fail to develop an adequate theory of how value is determined and how exploitation occurs under capitalism. His labour-time theory of value was indeed confused, and his faith in peaceful transformation through mutual credit was indeed unrealistic. Proudhon was wounded by Marx's attack. In his marginal notes on a copy of The Poverty of Philosophy, he wrote bitterly that Marx should start by being right before making jokes at others' expense. But Proudhon never published a systematic response. He felt Marx had misunderstood and misrepresented him. But he also may have recognized that some of Marx's criticisms hit home. The split between Marx and Proudhon became a split in the socialist movement itself. It represented two fundamentally different approaches to understanding and fighting capitalism. The Marxist approach emphasized historical materialism, class struggle, revolutionary overthrow of the capitalist state, and a transitional period of proletarian dictatorship leading eventually to communist society. The Proudhonian approach emphasized mutualism, federalism, rejection of all political authority, peaceful transformation through economic organization, and immediate implementation of anarchist principles. This divide became institutionalized in the First International Working Men's Association, founded in 1864. Although Proudhon died in 1865, his followers, particularly Mikhail Bakunin, who had been influenced by Proudhon's ideas, carried on the anarchist tendency within the International. The conflict between Marxists and anarchists over strategy, organization, and ultimate aims would eventually tear the International apart in the early 1870s. The Marxist-anarchist split shaped socialist politics for generations. In the 20th century, communist parties following Marx's ideas established dictatorships that claimed to be building socialism, but that anarchists viewed as state capitalist tyrannies. Anarchist movements, drawing on Proudhon's Federalist Principles, organized revolutionary societies in Spain during the Civil War and influenced various autonomous movements worldwide. The two traditions remained hostile, each blaming the other for the failures of socialism. Today, historians and political theorists debate whether the split was necessary or whether Marx and Proudhon could have found common ground. They shared much in their critique of capitalism. Both recognized exploitation and alienation. Both wanted workers to control production. Both sought a classless society. Their differences were primarily about method, historical analysis versus dialectical idealism, revolutionary seizure of power versus peaceful federative transformation. Some scholars argue that Marx was right in his critiques, but wrong in his alternatives, that while Proudhon's specific proposals were flawed, his federalist vision was sounder than Marx's faith in the dictatorship of the proletariat. Others maintain that Proudhon's entire approach was pre-scientific, that Marx's historical materialism represented a genuine advance in understanding how societies change. What is undeniable is that the split impoverished both traditions. Marxism developed sophisticated economic and historical analysis, but often justified authoritarian practices in the name of revolutionary necessity. Anarchism maintained commitment to immediate freedom and federative organization, but often lacked realistic analysis of how to achieve transformation against determined opposition. A synthesis of Marx's analytical rigor and Proudhon's federative principles might have produced a more viable revolutionary theory, but the personal and political antagonism made such synthesis impossible. Part 5. Revolution without violence. One of Proudhon's most distinctive and controversial positions was his insistence that social revolution must occur peacefully, without violence or insurrection. This stance put him at odds not only with Marxists, but with most of the revolutionary tradition. Understanding why Proudhon held this position, and how it shaped his political practice, reveals both the strengths and limitations of his philosophy. For most 19th-century revolutionaries, violent overthrow of the existing order seemed both necessary and inevitable. The French Revolution had established the paradigm, masses rising up, storming Bastilles, guillotining aristocrats, fighting in the streets against royalist forces. Subsequent uprisings in 1830 and 1848 reinforced this image of revolution as armed insurrection. Proudhon rejected this entire model. His opposition to revolutionary violence was not based on pacifist principle or moral squeamishness. He had no illusions about the brutality of the existing order. Rather, it was based on a strategic analysis of what violence actually achieves. Violence, Proudhon argued, cannot create justice. It can only destroy and replace one form of domination with another. An insurrection might topple a government, but it does not by itself transform social relations or economic structures. The French Revolution had overthrown monarchy, but it did not end exploitation. It merely replaced feudal lords with bourgeois capitalists. Violence seizes state power, but state power itself is the problem. Moreover, violence breeds authoritarianism. Revolutionary movements that embrace violence must organize themselves hierarchically to be effective in armed struggle. They develop command structures, military discipline, and habits of imposing decisions from above. After victory, these authoritarian patterns persist. The revolutionary vanguard becomes a new ruling class, using the state apparatus it seized to impose its vision on society. Proudhon saw this pattern clearly in the French revolutionary tradition. The Jacobins, the most radical faction during the Revolution, had established a dictatorship under the Committee of Public Safety, guillotining not only aristocrats but also rival revolutionaries and anyone deemed enemies of the Republic. The terror, justified as necessary to defend the revolution, had created its own tyranny. Napoleon's empire, which emerged from revolutionary chaos, was even more dictatorial than the monarchy it replaced. The lesson Proudhon drew was that means determine ends. You cannot create a free society through authoritarian means. You cannot establish justice through injustice. You cannot build voluntary cooperation on a foundation of coercion. A revolution that embraces violence will produce a violent order. A revolution organized hierarchically will produce a hierarchical society. So what did Proudhon propose instead? Social revolution, in his vision, meant fundamental transformation of economic relations, not seizure of political power. Workers would organize themselves into cooperatives, establish mutual banks, create federations of free communes. These new institutions would grow within the shell of the old society, gradually replacing capitalist enterprises and making the state irrelevant. This process would be revolutionary in its effects, completely transforming how society produces and distributes goods, how power is organized, how humans relate to each other. But it would be peaceful in its means, achieved through voluntary organization and economic competition, rather than through armed struggle. Proudhon called this mutualist reorganization. Workers would not wait for permission from the state or for revolutionary crisis. They would begin immediately to create alternative institutions. Every cooperative formed, every mutual insurance scheme established, every local federation organized was a step toward the new society. As these alternatives proliferated and demonstrated their superiority, more workers would join, the capitalist economy would shrink, and the state would lose its base of support. Now, we must examine how Proudhon attempted to put these ideas into practice during the revolutionary year of 1848. In February of that year, another uprising in Paris overthrew the monarchy and established the Second Republic. Proudhon, despite his anti-political stance, was elected to the Constituent Assembly in June. This might seem contradictory, an anarchist entering Parliament, but Proudhon saw it as an opportunity to promote his ideas from within the system. His experience in the Assembly was disillusioning. He found himself surrounded by bourgeois politicians whose interest in the working class extended only to using workers for their own political projects. When Proudhon proposed concrete measures to address workers' needs, like establishing a national bank to provide credit to producers, his fellow representatives dismissed him as a dangerous radical. More broadly, Proudhon believed the revolution of 1848 was doomed to fail because it lacked sound theoretical foundations. Workers had risen up out of desperation and genuine grievances, but they had no clear vision of what alternative society they wanted to build. The revolutionaries who claimed to lead them, whether liberal republicans or utopian socialists, offered only abstract ideals or impractical schemes. During this period, Proudhon edited a series of newspapers where he developed and promoted his ideas. He started with The Representative of the People in February 1848, followed by 3 more publications, as each was shut down in turn by government censorship. Through these papers, he argued that the revolution must focus on economic transformation, not merely political change, and that workers must organize themselves independently rather than relying on politicians. Proudhon's major practical effort was his attempt to establish the Bank of the People in early 1849. This was to be the key institution for peaceful revolutionary transformation, providing interest-free credit that would allow workers to form cooperatives and acquire productive resources. Proudhon sought capital through voluntary subscriptions, appealing to workers to contribute what they could to build an alternative financial system. The bank attracted considerable attention and some subscriptions. Proudhon was able to open an office and begin planning operations. But the project faced immediate problems. Workers, being poor by definition, could not subscribe large enough amounts to capitalize a bank that could make meaningful loans. Wealthier people had no interest in funding an institution designed to undermine their economic position. And the state, far from being neutral, actively worked to undermine the project. In March 1849, Proudhon was convicted of seditious libel for articles he had written criticizing the new President Louis Napoleon. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison and began serving his sentence in June. Before entering prison, Proudhon liquidated the Bank of the People to prevent it from falling into government hands. The experiment had lasted only a few months and had never actually issued loans. It died before it could test whether mutual credit could function as Proudhon envisioned. Proudhon's imprisonment was not entirely wasted time. He wrote prolifically, producing his analysis of the 1848 revolution in Confessions of a Revolutionary and continuing to contribute to newspapers under his direction despite being confined. His physical conditions were relatively comfortable as prisons went. He had books, writing materials, and was allowed visitors. But the experience deepened his understanding of state power and confirmed his anarchist convictions. The failure of the Bank of the People and the broader failure of the 1848 revolution raised serious questions about Proudhon's strategy. If peaceful transformation through economic organization was viable, why had it failed? If workers could simply build alternatives and outcompete capitalism, why were they unable to do so? If the state would become irrelevant as economic power shifted, why did the state remain powerful enough to imprison revolutionaries and crush their projects? Proudhon never fully grappled with these questions. He tended to blame the failure on lack of understanding among workers and inadequate theoretical preparation. If only workers understood mutualist principles better, if only they had proper organization and sufficient capital, the experiment could succeed. He maintained his faith in peaceful transformation even as evidence mounted that the existing order would not permit such transformation to proceed unmolested. Critics, particularly Marxists, argued that Proudhon's failure proved the necessity of revolutionary violence. The capitalist class and its state would never peacefully surrender power. Any attempt to build alternatives would be crushed unless workers could defend themselves militarily and seize state power to protect their revolution. Peaceful transformation was a fantasy that only served to disarm workers and delay necessary confrontation. But Proudhon's defenders could point to the fate of violent revolutions, which often produced new tyrannies rather than genuine emancipation. The terror during the French Revolution, the authoritarian drift of revolutionary movements, the eventual rise of Napoleon, all suggested that violence undermined revolutionary aims even when it succeeded in seizing power. Perhaps Proudhon was right. That means determine ends, even if his alternative means proved insufficient. This tension between the inadequacy of peaceful means and the dangers of violent means remains unresolved in revolutionary theory. Subsequent history provided evidence for both positions. Violent communist revolutions did seize power, but created authoritarian states that bore little resemblance to the classless societies they claimed to be building. Peaceful reformist movements often achieved improvements in workers' conditions, but failed to fundamentally transform capitalist relations. Anarchist movements, influenced by Proudhon's federalism but willing to embrace violence, like the Spanish anarchists during the Civil War of the 1930s, showed that the dilemma was real. They implemented Proudhon's vision of worker-controlled production and federative organization in revolutionary Catalonia, but they also had to fight militarily against fascist forces. Their revolution was ultimately crushed, whether because they were insufficiently violent and organized, or because revolutionary violence invited overwhelming counter-revolutionary force, remains debated. What Proudhon's emphasis on peaceful transformation did contribute was a consistent focus on building the alternative society in the present, rather than postponing freedom to some post-revolutionary future. If you want a free, federative, cooperative society, then begin creating free, federative, cooperative institutions now. Do not wait for the revolution to create these things. Create them as part of the revolutionary process. This principle, that the new society must be built within the shell of the old, that revolutionary means must embody revolutionary ends, has influenced movements from anarcho-syndicalism to contemporary anti-authoritarian organizing. It represents Proudhon's most enduring strategic contribution, even if his belief that such building could proceed entirely peacefully proved overly optimistic. Part 6, where Proudhon failed. No honest assessment of Proudhon's philosophy can ignore its failures, and these failures were numerous and significant. Some arose from limitations in his theoretical analysis, others from impractical proposals, still others from his inability to bridge the gap between abstract principles and concrete reality. Understanding where Proudhon went wrong is as important as understanding where he was right. Start with his economic theory, particularly his labor theory of value. Proudhon argued that the value of a commodity should equal the labor time invested in producing it, and that exchanges should occur on the basis of equal labor time. This seems simple and just, but it founders on basic economic realities. Different types of labor have vastly different productivity. An hour of a skilled engineer's labor produces more value than an hour of an unskilled laborer's labor because skill, training, and talent affect output. An hour spent with advanced machinery produces more than an hour with primitive tools. An hour spent producing something people urgently need has different value than an hour producing something nobody wants. Proudhon recognized these differences but could never adequately incorporate them into his theory. He would speak vaguely of weighting labor time by skill level or social utility, but he never developed a workable mechanism for determining these weights. Who decides that engineering labor counts as twice, or 5 times, or 10 times basic labor? If you use market prices to determine weights, you are back to capitalism. If you use social consensus, you need some kind of central authority to aggregate preferences. Marx's critique on this point was devastating. Marx showed that in capitalism, labor itself becomes a commodity with a price determined by supply and demand, like any commodity. Workers sell their labour power, their capacity to work, for wages that equal roughly the cost of reproducing that labour power, meaning the cost of food, shelter, and other necessities the worker needs to survive and continue working. But the labour power that capitalists purchase can produce more value than it costs to maintain. A worker might produce 8 hours' worth of value, but only need 4 hours' worth of value to survive. The extra 4 hours of value is surplus value, which the capitalist appropriates as profit. This is exploitation, and it occurs not because exchanges are unfair measured by labour time, but because workers are forced to sell their labour power in the first place. Proudhon completely missed this mechanism. By failing to distinguish between labour and labour power, by treating labour as something with inherent value rather than as a social relationship, he could not explain how exploitation actually works in capitalism. His schemes for equal exchange based on labour time would not eliminate exploitation because they did not address the fundamental problem, workers' separation from the means of production. His mutual credit system contained similar problems. Proudhon argued that banks should extend interest-free credit backed by the productive capacity of borrowers. But how do you determine someone's productive capacity before they have produced anything? How do you assess whether a new enterprise will succeed? Capitalist banks use collateral and charge interest precisely because lending is risky, borrowers might fail to repay, and interest compensates for that risk while collateral provides security. A mutual bank without collateral or interest would face immediate difficulties. It would have to somehow assess creditworthiness, which requires information and judgment. It would need reserves to cover inevitable defaults. It would have to compete with conventional banks that can offer market rates of interest to attract deposits. All of these practical problems defeated Proudhon's actual attempts to create such a bank. More fundamentally, Proudhon's belief that access to credit would enable workers to form cooperatives and outcompete capitalist enterprises was naive. Even with access to credit, cooperatives face systematic disadvantages in capitalist economies. They cannot easily exploit workers to maximize profits the way capitalist firms can. They have more difficulty making quick decisions because democratic processes take time. They often face hostility from conventional banks, suppliers, and customers who view cooperative ownership as unusual or risky. Historically, cooperatives have been most successful in niches or with state support, not as a general alternative to capitalism. The Mondragon cooperatives in Spain, perhaps the most successful large-scale cooperative system, emerged with significant support from Catholic social teaching and Spanish law, not through the organic growth Proudhon envisioned. They remain a small part of the global economy, despite decades of operation. Proudhon's federalism, while attractive in principle, also contained practical weaknesses. He never adequately explained how disputes between federations would be resolved, how free riders who accept benefits but do not contribute would be handled, or how coordination would occur for projects requiring large-scale planning. Take something like a railroad network. This requires enormous capital investment, standardized technology, coordinated scheduling across vast distances, and maintenance of infrastructure. Could a purely federative system of voluntary associations accomplish this? Perhaps, but Proudhon never detailed how. He tended to assert that federative principles could handle any coordination problem without demonstrating the mechanisms. Modern complex economies require coordination on scales and at speeds that voluntary negotiation between autonomous associations might not achieve. global supply chains, integrated energy systems, telecommunications networks all require centralized planning to some degree. The alternative of pure market coordination produces waste and instability, as capitalism demonstrates, but federative coordination without markets or planning faces its own difficulties. Proudhon's faith in reputation and mutual interest as enforcement mechanisms also proved insufficient. In small communities where everyone knows everyone and expects future interactions, reputation matters enormously and can substitute for legal enforcement. But in large, anonymous, mobile societies, reputation is less powerful. Bad actors can simply move, change identities, or operate across jurisdictions where reputation does not follow. His political strategy of peaceful transformation was perhaps his greatest practical failure. Proudhon assumed that capitalists would accept being outcompeted, that the state would allow alternative institutions to grow, and that workers could build the new society within the shell of the old without violent confrontation. All of these assumptions proved false. Ruling classes do not surrender power peacefully when their dominance is threatened. They use law, police, military force, propaganda, economic pressure, and any other tool available to crush alternatives. The state is not neutral, it is an instrument of class power, and it will be deployed against revolutionary movements, whether those movements embrace violence or not. Proudhon's imprisonment and the suppression of his Bank of the People demonstrated this clearly, yet he never fully absorbed the lesson. Another failure was Proudhon's dialectical method itself. While his identification of contradictions in capitalism was often insightful, his belief that these contradictions could be resolved through synthesis was based on logical analysis rather than material forces. He thought contradictions could be transcended intellectually by finding the right principles and implementing the right institutions. But contradictions in capitalism are not primarily intellectual problems. They are conflicts between material interests and power relationships. The contradiction between social production and private appropriation exists not because no one has thought of the right synthesis, but because those who benefit from private appropriation have the power to maintain it and resist alternatives. You cannot resolve such contradictions through clever institutional design. You can only resolve them through changing the balance of power. Proudhon also failed to develop an adequate theory of historical change. He understood that societies evolve and that feudalism had given way to capitalism, but he had no systematic account of what drives such transitions. Marx's historical materialism, whatever its flaws, at least provided a framework for understanding how changes in productive forces and relations generate social transformation. Proudhon had no comparable framework, only his dialectical analysis of contradictions. This meant he could not explain why workers would adopt mutualism, why cooperatives would form, why mutual banks would emerge, except by assuming that people would recognize the superiority of these arrangements through reason. But people often do not act on reason alone, especially when power relations constrain their choices. A comprehensive theory of change requires understanding interests, power, organization, and consciousness, not just good ideas. Proudhon's conception of human nature was also simplistic. He argued that humans are both self-interested individuals and social beings, but he never adequately explained how these aspects relate or how social arrangements might emphasize one over the other. He seemed to assume that in proper conditions, meaning mutualist organization, people would naturally cooperate based on mutual interest and reciprocity. But he provided little analysis of what happens when interests conflict or when reciprocity breaks down. Modern game theory and behavioral economics have shown that cooperation in large groups requires institutional support, not just good intentions. People cooperate when mechanisms exist to detect and punish free riding, to coordinate expectations, and to build trust over repeated interactions. Proudhon's federalism lacked such mechanisms in any detail. Finally, Proudhon failed to seriously engage with the problem of transition. Suppose everything he proposed was theoretically sound. Suppose mutualism really was superior to both capitalism and state socialism. How do you get from the current world, dominated by states and capital, with overwhelming military and economic power, to a mutualist federation? What concrete steps do workers take? What strategies do they employ? What obstacles must be overcome? Proudhon's answer, form cooperatives and mutual banks, and the old order will gradually become irrelevant, was no answer at all. It ignored the coercive power that existing institutions would deploy to prevent such alternatives. It underestimated the structural advantages that states and capitals possess, and it overestimated workers' capacity for autonomous organization under conditions of poverty and repression. These failures do not mean Proudhon's entire project was worthless. His critique of property as exploitation, his vision of worker-controlled production, his federative principles, his emphasis on building alternatives in the present all contain valuable insights that remain relevant. But they do mean that Proudhonism, taken as a complete program, was inadequate as a guide for revolutionary transformation. Understanding these failures is not an exercise in demolishing Proudhon, but in learning from him. Every political philosopher makes errors, proposes impractical schemes, and leaves problems unresolved. What matters is extracting what is valuable while recognizing and correcting what is flawed. Proudhon's failures point toward questions that any liberatory politics must address: how to organize complex economies without either markets or central planning, how to maintain freedom while achieving coordination, how to transform society against the resistance of entrenched power. That he could not answer these questions does not make them less important. Part 7. The Dark Side. No honest examination of Proudhon can avoid confronting the ugliest aspects of his thought and character. Beyond his theoretical failures, Proudhon held views that were morally repugnant and philosophically inconsistent with his own stated principles. These were not minor flaws or products of his time that can be easily excused. They were deep prejudices that undermined his claim to be a philosopher of universal human liberation. The most shocking and indefensible aspect of Proudhon's character was his virulent anti-Semitism. In his private notebooks, which were published after his death, Proudhon wrote passages of stunning hatred. He called for Jews to be expelled from Europe or exterminated, describing them as enemies of humankind. These were not offhand remarks or isolated incidents. They reflected a consistent pattern of prejudice throughout his writings. Now we must be careful to understand this in context without excusing it. Anti-Semitism was widespread in 19th-century Europe, not just among reactionaries, but also among socialists and radicals. Many socialist thinkers conflated Judaism with financial capitalism. viewing Jews as symbols of usury and exploitation. Charles Fourier, another utopian socialist whom Proudhon studied, expressed similar prejudices. Even Marx, himself of Jewish heritage, wrote essays containing anti-Semitic tropes. But Proudhon's anti-Semitism went beyond the casual prejudice common to his era. He advocated extermination, a position so extreme that even many of his contemporaries would have found it shocking. There is no philosophical justification for this hatred in his system. It was pure bigotry that contradicted his stated principles of human dignity and mutual respect. The historical consequences of such thinking are evident. In the early 20th century, right-wing nationalists in France attempted to claim Proudhon as one of their intellectual ancestors. The Cercle Proudhon, founded in 1911, tried to synthesize Proudhon's mutualism with Charles Morris' integral nationalism. Some of these figures would later move toward fascism, and they drew on Proudhon's anti-Semitism to justify their positions. This appropriation was dishonest in many ways. Proudhon was fundamentally opposed to nationalism and state power in ways incompatible with fascism. But the fact that fascists could find material in his writings to support their ideology reveals how toxic his prejudices were. A thinker who claims to champion human freedom cannot simultaneously advocate the extermination of entire peoples based on their ethnicity or religion. Proudhon's attitudes toward women were equally problematic, though they manifested differently. He was a fierce patriarch who believed in strict gender hierarchy within the family. In his massive work on justice in the Revolution and in the Church, published in 1858, Proudhon devoted extensive sections to defending traditional family structure with the man as absolute head of household. Proudhon argued that women were naturally inferior to men in physical and intellectual capacities. He claimed this inferiority was not a matter of social conditioning, but of biological fact. Women's proper role, in his view, was in the domestic sphere as wives and mothers, subordinate to male authority. Any attempt by women to claim equality or enter public life was contrary to nature and would undermine social order. When feminists of his era challenged these views, Proudhon responded with contempt. The socialist feminist Flora Tristan, whom Proudhon had met in Paris, advocated for women's rights and social equality. After her death, Proudhon wrote dismissively of her ideas. Later, when the anarchist Joseph Desjacques criticized Proudhon's patriarchal views and urged him to speak out against men's exploitation of women, Proudhon ignored the challenge. Desjacques went so far as to tell Proudhon that he could not legitimately call himself an anarchist if he refused to oppose the domination of women by men. This was a devastating critique, because it exposed a fundamental contradiction in Proudhon's philosophy. How can someone who claims to oppose all forms of domination and hierarchy vigorously defend male domination over women? How can someone who champions mutual respect and voluntary association insist on compulsory female subordination within the family? Proudhon never resolved this contradiction because he never acknowledged it as a contradiction. He seems to have genuinely believed that gender hierarchy was natural and therefore not a form of unjust domination. But this is intellectually incoherent. If domination is wrong, if human dignity requires autonomy and equality, then these principles must apply universally, or they apply not at all. You cannot pick and choose which humans deserve freedom based on their sex. Modern anarchist and socialist thinkers have uniformly rejected Proudhon's patriarchal views as incompatible with anarchist principles. Anarchist movements have largely embraced gender equality, and many have developed sophisticated analyses of how patriarchy intersects with capitalism and state power to maintain systems of domination. But this required abandoning Proudhon's explicit teachings on gender, even while drawing on his economic and political insights. Some defenders of Proudhon have tried to minimize these problems by arguing that we should separate his valuable contributions from his personal prejudices. They point out that his federalism, his critique of property, and his vision of worker self-management can be adopted without accepting his anti-Semitism or misogyny. This is true to some extent. Ideas can be separated from their originators. But we must also ask whether these prejudices were truly separate from Proudhon's core philosophy, or whether they reveal deeper problems in his thinking. His patriarchy, for instance, was not a minor personal flaw, but a systematic position he defended at length in his major works. It was integrated into his conception of the family as the foundational unit of society and his theory of justice as rooted in familial relations. The fact that Proudhon could champion equality and mutual respect while simultaneously defending the subordination of half of humanity suggests that his philosophical principles were not as rigorous or consistently applied as he claimed. It reveals a capacity for self-deception and rationalization that should make us skeptical of his other claims. If he could so thoroughly deceive himself about gender relations, what other blind spots might his analysis contain? We must also consider how Proudhon's prejudices affected his political practice and influence. His dismissive attitude toward women limited the appeal of his ideas and excluded potential supporters and collaborators. His anti-Semitism, while it may have resonated with prejudices common among some workers, reinforced exactly the kind of scapegoating and division that the workers' movement should have been combating. In the history of political thought, few major figures are entirely admirable as human beings. Marx was arrogant and vindictive. Bakunin was often dishonest and conspiratorial. Kropotkin had his own blind spots. But acknowledging human flaws does not require minimizing serious moral failures. Proudhon's anti-Semitism and misogyny were not quirks of personality. They were positions he actively promoted and defended. For those who wish to learn from Proudhon today, this creates a genuine difficulty. How do you engage with a thinker whose insights remain valuable but whose prejudices were abhorrent? The answer cannot be to simply ignore or excuse the prejudices. That would be intellectually dishonest and morally contemptible. Nor can it be to dismiss everything he wrote because of his flaws. That would mean losing potentially valuable ideas. The better approach is critical engagement. Take what is useful while explicitly rejecting what is harmful. Recognize that Proudhon's critique of capitalist property and his vision of federative organization contain genuine insights, while his views on women and Jews were both morally wrong and philosophically inconsistent with his own stated principles. Use his failures as lessons about the dangers of allowing prejudice to corrupt even radical political philosophy. It is also worth noting what this reveals about the limitations of abstract principle alone. Proudhon could articulate beautiful principles about justice, equality, and mutual respect, but principles mean nothing if they are not applied universally and consistently. Every tyrant has claimed to support justice while denying it to some group deemed inferior or threatening. What distinguishes genuine commitment to human freedom from hollow rhetoric is the willingness to extend it to everyone without exception. Proudhon failed this test profoundly. His thought contains valuable elements, but it also contains poison. Anyone drawing on his work must carefully extract the former while completely rejecting the latter, and they must remain vigilant against the tendency to make exceptions to universal principles based on prejudice or convenience, because that path leads directly to the kinds of hatreds Proudhon embraced. Part 8. Legacy and Evolution. Despite his personal failings and theoretical limitations, Proudhon's ideas exerted enormous influence on radical movements for generations after his death. His legacy is complex and often contradictory, as different movements drew on different aspects of his thought and developed them in directions he might not have recognized or endorsed. Proudhon died in January of 1865 at age 56, worn out by years of poverty, imprisonment and exile. He left behind a massive body of work, over 40 volumes of books, articles, letters and notebooks. He also left behind a growing movement of workers and intellectuals who had been inspired by his vision of a society without government or capitalist exploitation. The most important figure in carrying forward and transforming Proudhon's ideas was Mikhail Bakunin, the Russian revolutionary who would become the other founding father of anarchism alongside Proudhon. Bakunin had met Proudhon in Paris in the 1840s and was profoundly influenced by his anarchist vision. But Bakunin was a very different character from Proudhon, where Proudhon was a methodical theorist who distrusted revolutionary violence. Bakunin was a passionate insurgent who embraced armed struggle. Bakunin adopted Proudhon's rejection of the state and his vision of federative organization. He agreed that society should be organized from the bottom up, through voluntary associations, rather than governed from the top down by centralized authority. He shared Proudhon's critique of state socialism, arguing that Marx's dictatorship of the proletariat would simply create a new form of tyranny, with party bureaucrats replacing capitalists as the ruling class. But Bakunin broke sharply with Proudhon's mutualism on economic questions. Where Proudhon had defended individual possession and mutual exchange, Bakunin advocated collectivism. He argued that land and the instruments of production should be owned collectively by workers' associations rather than possessed individually. He rejected Proudhon's labour exchange system and his mutual credit schemes as too individualistic and impractical. More significantly, Bakunin embraced revolutionary violence in ways Proudhon had explicitly rejected. Bakunin believed that the state and capitalism could only be destroyed through insurrection, that workers must be prepared to fight, and that revolutionary organizations should include secret conspiratorial networks to coordinate action. This was the opposite of Proudhon's peaceful gradualism. The differences between Proudhon and Bakunin reflected a broader evolution of anarchist thought from its mutualist origins toward more revolutionary forms. After Proudhon's death, his followers in the First International Working Men's Association, particularly the French and Belgian delegates, found themselves increasingly drawn to more militant positions under Bakunin's influence. The Paris Commune of 1871 became a crucial testing ground for these ideas. When workers seized control of Paris and attempted to establish a revolutionary government, many of the Commune's organizers were influenced by Proudhonian ideas of federalism and worker self-management. The Commune established cooperatives, federated neighbourhoods, and attempted to implement direct democracy. But the Commune also had to defend itself militarily against the French government's attempts to crush it. This required hierarchical military organisation and centralised decision-making that contradicted pure federalist principles. When the Commune was finally defeated after 2 months, and thousands of workers were massacred, both Marxists and anarchists claimed it as validation of their positions. Marx argued that the Commune showed the necessity of seizing state power and using it to suppress the bourgeoisie. Bakunin and the anarchists argued that it showed the vitality of workers' self-organisation and the impossibility of using state power for liberatory ends. Both interpretations contained elements of truth, and both shaped how subsequent movements understood the relationship between revolution and state power. After the split in the First International in 1872, which pitted Bakunin's anarchist faction against Marx's authoritarian faction, anarchist movements developed in multiple directions. Collectivist anarchism, as developed by Bakunin and his followers like James Guillaume, emphasized collective ownership while maintaining federative organization and direct action. Anarcho-communism, developed primarily by Peter Kropotkin beginning in the 1870s, went further in rejecting individual appropriation. Kropotkin argued that in a free society, resources should be distributed according to need rather than according to labor contribution. The slogan, "From each according to ability, to each according to need," came to define anarcho-communist aspirations. This was far removed from Proudhon's insistence on reciprocal exchange based on labor time. Yet Kropotkin still drew heavily on Proudhon's federalism and his critique of state power. Kropotkin's vision of free communes federating voluntarily for mutual aid was essentially Proudhonian, even as his economics moved toward communism that Proudhon had rejected. This illustrates how later anarchists extracted certain elements from Proudhon while abandoning others. Anarcho-syndicalism, which emerged in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, represented another evolution of Proudhonian ideas. Syndicalists organized workers into revolutionary unions that would both fight for immediate improvements and prepare to take over indices through general strikes. The syndicalist vision of worker-controlled indices organized through federations of unions echoed Proudhon's labor associations and Federative Principle. The Spanish anarchists who implemented this vision during the Civil War of 1936–39 created the most extensive example of Proudhonian principles in practice. In revolutionary Catalonia, workers seized factories and farms, organized them as collectives, and coordinated production through federations. For a brief period, millions of people lived under a system that approximated what Proudhon had envisioned: worker self-management without state control or capitalist ownership. The experiment was not without problems. Coordination between collectives proved difficult, some collectives were more successful than others, and the demands of fighting a civil war created pressures toward centralization. Eventually, the revolution was crushed by a combination of fascist military victory and communist sabotage from within the Republican side. But the Spanish experience showed that Proudhonian federalism could work at significant scale, even if it faced immense practical challenges. Individualist anarchism, particularly as developed in America by Benjamin Tucker and others, drew more directly on Proudhon's mutualism. Tucker translated Proudhon's work into English and promoted mutual banking and labor exchange systems. American individualist anarchists emphasize free markets without capitalism, arguing that once monopolies were broken and access to credit democratized through mutual banks, market exchange among independent producers would ensure justice. This tradition has had a complex afterlife. Some contemporary libertarians who support free markets and oppose state power claim kinship with Proudhon and Tucker, but most have abandoned the anti-capitalism that was central to their vision. True left-wing market anarchism, which combines markets with opposition to capitalist property relations, remains a minority position, but one that claims direct descent from Proudhon. Proudhon's influence extended beyond self-identified anarchists. His critique of centralized state socialism influenced various libertarian socialist traditions. Council communists who emphasized workers' councils rather than party dictatorship. Autonomous Marxists who rejected Leninist vanguardism, and various anti-authoritarian socialist movements all drew on arguments that Proudhon had pioneered. Even some mainstream political developments bore traces of Proudhonian thinking. The cooperative movement that spread across Europe in the late 19th century, creating consumer cooperatives, producer cooperatives, and mutual insurance societies, was directly inspired by Proudhon's mutualism. Credit unions, which provide financial services on a non-profit basis owned by members, realized aspects of his mutual banking vision. Federalism, as a political principle, though usually implemented within state structures rather than as an alternative to states, drew on arguments Proudhon had developed. His critique of centralization and his vision of power distributed among autonomous units that coordinate voluntarily influenced various federal and decentralist movements. In the 20th century, Proudhon's direct influence waned as anarchist movements were crushed by fascist and communist dictatorships and as social democracy and revolutionary Marxism became the dominant forms of socialism. But his ideas never entirely disappeared. The New Left of the 1960s, particularly its emphasis on participatory democracy and decentralization, echoed Proudhonian themes even when participants were unaware of the connection. Contemporary anti-globalization movements, autonomous politics, and various forms of direct democracy activism often operate on implicitly Proudhonian principles. The emphasis on horizontal organization, consensus decision-making, direct action rather than electoral politics, and building alternative institutions in the present rather than waiting for revolutionary transformation all have roots in Proudhon's federalism and his strategy of creating the new society within the shell of the old. Worker cooperatives continue to exist, and new ones form regularly, though they remain a tiny fraction of the global economy. Platform cooperatives, which apply cooperative principles to digital platforms, represent a modern attempt to implement Proudhonian economics in the technology sector. Mutual aid networks, which proliferated during the pandemic and other crises, embody the principle of reciprocal support that Proudhon championed. The contradictions in Proudhon's legacy reflect contradictions in his thought itself. His federalism inspired genuinely revolutionary movements, while his mutualism suggested gradual reform through economic competition. His anarchism rejected all authority, while his patriarchy defended male authority in the family. His internationalism opposed nationalism, while his prejudices fostered division. Different movements took different lessons, emphasizing some aspects while ignoring or repudiating others. What survived most powerfully was not Proudhon's specific economic proposals, which proved largely impractical, but his core insights about power and organization. The principle that authority must always be questioned and challenged, that social organization should flow from bottom to top rather than top to bottom, that workers should control their own labor rather than submitting to bosses or bureaucrats. These ideas remained vital even as the mechanisms Proudhon proposed for achieving them were revised or abandoned. Proudhon's legacy is thus not a fixed doctrine, but a living tradition of critical thought and experimental practice. Each generation has reinterpreted his ideas in light of new conditions, kept what seemed valuable, and modified or rejected what proved unworkable. This process of evolution and adaptation is perhaps the most Proudhonian aspect of Proudhon's legacy. The refusal to treat any authority, even the authority of the founder himself, as beyond question. Part 9. Scholarly Debates and Modern Critiques. Academic assessment of Proudhon has been contentious from his lifetime to the present. Scholars across disciplines, from political theory to economics to history to philosophy, have debated his significance, interpreted his ideas in conflicting ways, and disagreed fundamentally about whether his contributions were valuable or disastrous. These debates reveal as much about the scholars and their ideological commitments as they do about Proudhon himself. The earliest scholarly responses were deeply partisan, shaped by the ideological battles of the 19th century socialist movement. Marxist scholars, following Marx's own devastating critique, generally dismissed Proudhon as a confused, petty bourgeois utopian whose mutualism represented backward-looking nostalgia for artisan production rather than a forward-looking revolutionary program. They argued that his failure to understand capitalism's real dynamics and his rejection of class struggle made him worse than useless, actively harmful to the workers' movement. Anarchist scholars, conversely, defended Proudhon as a visionary who recognized dangers in centralized socialism that Marxists ignored until Stalinism made them impossible to deny. They argued that his federalism and his insistence on immediate implementation of libertarian principles, rather than postponing freedom to a post-revolutionary future, represented genuine theoretical advances. His mutualist economics might have been flawed, but his political philosophy contained profound truths about power and organization. Academic historians in the early 20th century often viewed Proudhon as a transitional figure, important for understanding the development of socialist thought, but superseded by more sophisticated later theories. George Woodcock's influential book, Anarchism, published in 1962, placed Proudhon at the origins of the anarchist tradition, but suggested that Bakunin and Kropotkin developed anarchist theory beyond Proudhon's limitations. This became a common interpretation: Proudhon as founding father, but not the most developed anarchist thinker. French scholars tended to take Proudhon more seriously than Anglo-American academics, partly because his works remained more accessible in French, and partly because he represented an important strand of French Republican and socialist tradition. Henri de Lubac's 1948 study. The un-Marxian socialist examined Proudhon's religious and philosophical ideas in depth, arguing that his thought contained sophisticated theological dimensions usually overlooked by political interpreters. The attempted appropriation of Proudhon by French right-wing nationalists in the early 20th century, particularly the Cercle Proudhon, founded in 1911, created another scholarly controversy. Some historians argued that Proudhon's anti-Semitism and certain conservative elements in his thought made him a legitimate precursor to fascism. The Israeli historian Ziv Sternhell, a specialist in fascism, noted how Action Française, a far-right movement, claimed Proudhon as one of its intellectual masters. Anarchist scholars vigorously contested this interpretation, arguing that it represented a fundamental misreading. They pointed out that Proudhon's federalism, his opposition to nationalism, his rejection of state power, and his advocacy for workers' self-management were incompatible with fascist ideology. The fact that fascists selectively quoted him while ignoring the core of his philosophy proved nothing about Proudhon's actual views, only about fascist dishonesty. This debate highlighted a broader problem in Proudhon scholarship, the tendency to selectively emphasize certain aspects of his voluminous and sometimes contradictory writings to support predetermined interpretations. Because Proudhon wrote so much, across so many topics, over a career spanning 25 years, and because he often presented ideas dialectically by exploring multiple perspectives, it is possible to find passages supporting almost any interpretation if you cherry-pick carefully enough. Contemporary political theorist Daniel Guérin, writing in the 1960s and 70s, tried to construct what he called libertarian Marxism by synthesizing insights from both Marxist and anarchist traditions. Guérin argued that Proudhon's later work, particularly on justice, in the Revolution and in the Church, took a conservative turn that anarchists should reject. But Guérin also suggested that Proudhon's best insights about federalism and anti-authoritarianism could be combined with Marxist class analysis to produce a more viable revolutionary theory. Economic historians have generally been critical of Proudhon's economic theories. His labour theory of value is seen as primitive compared to Marx's more sophisticated analysis. His mutual credit schemes are dismissed as impractical fantasies that fail to understand how credit creation actually works in complex economies. His belief that cooperatives could outcompete capitalist firms is contradicted by historical evidence showing that cooperatives face systematic disadvantages in capitalist markets. However, some contemporary economists have found elements of value in Proudhon's thinking. David Ellerman, a philosopher and economist who has worked on workplace democracy, argues that Proudhon's distinction between possession and property contains important insights that mainstream economics overlooks. Ellerman's own work on the labour theory of property and worker self-management draws explicitly on Proudhonian foundations while developing them in more rigorous directions. Scholars of international relations have recently discovered Proudhon as a theorist of international order. Alex Pritchard's book Justice, Order and Anarchy, published in 2015, examines Proudhon's writings on war, peace and international relations, arguing that he developed the first anarchist theory of international politics. Pritchard shows that Proudhon's federalism was not just domestic but international, proposing a global order based on federated peoples rather than sovereign states. This recovery of Proudhon's international thought has opened new scholarly debates about whether anarchist theory offers viable alternatives to both realist and liberal approaches to global politics. If states are not natural or necessary, if federative organization could work at international scale, this would fundamentally challenge conventional assumptions about international relations. Critics argue that Proudhon's international federalism, like his domestic proposals, fails to address how such systems could emerge or maintain themselves against powerful states. Philosophical scholars have debated Proudhon's relationship to Hegel and the dialectical method. Some argue that Proudhon fundamentally misunderstood Hegel and that his dialectics were confused and inconsistent. Others suggest that Proudhon deliberately adapted Hegelian dialectics for his own purposes, transforming it from an idealist method into a tool for analyzing real economic contradictions. Still, others claim that Proudhon's dialectics, whatever their flaws, represented an original contribution that should not be measured solely against Hegelian standards. The debate over Proudhon's anti-Semitism and misogyny has intensified in recent decades as scholars have paid more attention to how prejudice intersects with political philosophy. Some scholars argue that these prejudices were peripheral to Proudhon's core contributions and can be separated from his valuable insights. Others insist that his hatreds were too deeply integrated into his thought to be easily excised, that they reveal fundamental problems in his philosophical method and political vision. Anarchist historian Iain Mackay, editor of the comprehensive anthology Property is Theft, confronts Proudhon's bigotry directly while arguing that his core ideas about property, federalism and worker self-management retain value. Mackay acknowledges that Proudhon's patriarchy contradicted his anarchist principles and that his anti-Semitism was inexcusable, but he maintains that these failings do not invalidate everything Proudhon wrote. This position has been challenged by scholars who argue that greater condemnation is warranted. Contemporary political movements have generated new scholarly interest in Proudhon's relevance. As neoliberal globalization has produced new concentrations of economic power, as representative democracy has seemed increasingly dysfunctional, and as centralized state socialism has been thoroughly discredited by Soviet collapse, Proudhon's alternative vision has gained fresh attention. Scholars studying worker cooperatives, platform cooperativism, participatory economics, and various experiments in decentralized decision-making have revisited Proudhon to see what insights his work might offer. While few embrace his specific proposals, many find his general orientation, skepticism toward both markets and states, emphasis on worker control, commitment to federative organization, valuable for thinking about alternatives to current systems. Critics argue that this contemporary interest represents wishful thinking rather than serious engagement with Proudhon's actual ideas and their limitations. They point out that a century and a half of history has not validated Proudhonian strategies, that cooperatives remain marginal, that mutual credit has not replaced capitalist banking, that federative organization has not superseded states. Proudhon's vision, they argue, has been tested and found wanting, and contemporary scholars who draw on him are simply repeating old mistakes. Defenders respond that Proudhon's ideas have never been fully tested under favorable conditions. Worker cooperatives and mutual credit systems have always operated within hostile capitalist environments where they face systematic disadvantages. The fact that they survive at all, much less occasionally thrive, suggests potential that could be realized if conditions were different. Moreover, the failures of state socialism and the crises of capitalism make exploring alternatives more urgent, not less. A particularly interesting scholarly debate concerns whether Proudhon should be classified as an anarchist at all in the modern sense of the term. He was certainly the first to embrace anarchism as a positive identity. But his mutualism, with its emphasis on contracts, markets and individual possession, differs sharply from the communism of Kropotkin or the revolutionary syndicalism of later anarchist movements. Some scholars suggest that Proudhon represents a distinct tradition, mutualist anarchism, that should not be conflated with social anarchism. Others argue that all these varieties, mutualism, collectivism, communism, syndicalism, are expressions of a common anarchist core that opposes hierarchy and advocates self-organization. The economic differences, while important, are secondary to the shared commitment to federalism and opposition to state power. This debate about how to classify Proudhon reflects broader disagreements about what defines anarchism itself. Methodologically, Proudhon's scholarship faces challenges that affect how he is interpreted. His works are enormous in volume, dense in argument, often repetitive, sometimes contradictory, and until recently, many were not available in English translation. This means most Anglo-American scholars encounter Proudhon through secondary sources rather than engaging with his text directly, creating opportunities for misrepresentation and misunderstanding. The nomothetical versus hermeneutical debate in Proudhon interpretation is revealing. Some scholars take a nomothetical approach, trying to extract a consistent scientific system from his works by emphasizing certain texts and interpretations while dismissing contradictory passages as errors or dialectical explorations. Others take a hermeneutical approach, trying to understand Proudhon in his full complexity and contradictoriness, seeing the tensions in his thought as meaningful rather than as problems to be resolved. The question of how to handle Proudhon's development over time also complicates interpretation. His early work, like What is Property, was more radical and uncompromising than his later work, which showed more conservative tendencies on some issues. Should scholars privilege the young Proudhon or the mature Proudhon? Different answers to this question produce different assessments of his overall contribution. Ultimately, scholarly debate about Proudhon is unlikely to reach consensus because the questions involved are not purely academic but deeply political. Whether Proudhon's ideas were valuable depends partly on your own commitments about how society should be organized, what strategies for change are viable, and what dangers most need to be avoided. Scholars approaching these questions with different assumptions will inevitably reach different conclusions about Proudhon's legacy. What can be said with confidence is that Proudhon remains relevant to contemporary debates precisely because he addressed questions that remain unresolved. How can complex modern economies be organized democratically without resorting to either capitalist markets or state planning? How can power be distributed to avoid tyranny without creating chaos? How can individual freedom be reconciled with collective coordination? These Proudhonian questions have not been answered satisfactorily, which is why scholars keep returning to his work, despite its limitations. Part 10. Final Assessment. We have now examined Pierre-Joseph Proudhon's philosophy from multiple angles, his core ideas, his methods, his practical proposals, his conflicts with other thinkers, his failures and successes, his prejudices, his legacy, and scholarly debates about his significance. What final assessment can we make of this complex, contradictory, and profoundly influential thinker? Proudhon's greatest contribution was his radical questioning of assumptions that most people treated as natural and inevitable. Private property is not a natural right, but a form of theft. Government is not necessary for social order, but an obstacle to it. Capitalism does not reward labour, but exploits it. Progress does not require hierarchy, but is hindered by it. Each of these claims challenged fundamental premises of 19th-century political economy and moral philosophy. By declaring property as theft, Proudhon forced examination of how ownership actually functions. He showed that legal property rights enable those who already have resources to extract value from those who lack them, that rent, profit and interest represent appropriation without corresponding contribution, that the entire system of capitalist property relations rests on legalized exploitation. Even scholars who reject his specific analysis must grapple with the questions he raised about the moral foundations of ownership. By embracing anarchism as positive identity, Proudhon pioneered an entire tradition of political thought that imagined society without government. Before Proudhon, anarchism meant disorder and chaos. After Proudhon, it meant voluntary association, federative organization, and order arising from mutual respect rather than imposed by authority. This was a conceptual revolution that opened space for thinking about alternatives to state power. Proudhon's federalism offered a genuine third way between capitalist markets and state planning, between individualism and collectivism. His vision of society, organized from bottom to top through voluntary contracts among free associations, with no sovereign power standing above the parts, represented an original contribution to political theory. Whether fully practicable or not, it provided an alternative model that influenced movements and thinkers for generations. His emphasis on worker self-management, on economic democracy as essential to political democracy, anticipated concerns that would become central to labor movements worldwide. Proudhon recognized that wage labor is a form of subordination, that voting rights mean little if you spend most of your waking hours under authoritarian control in the workplace, that genuine freedom requires workers to control their own labor. This insight remains profoundly relevant to contemporary debates about workplace democracy and economic justice. But Proudhon's failures were equally significant and cannot be minimized. His economic theories were confused and his practical proposals impractical. The labor theory of value, as he formulated it, could not explain how exploitation actually works in capitalism. His mutual credit schemes could not function at the scale necessary to transform an economy. His faith that cooperatives could outcompete capitalist firms without state support or revolutionary transformation proved naive. His philosophical method, while sometimes insightful in identifying contradictions, treated economic categories abstractly rather than as expressions of real social relations. This led him to propose logical syntheses that had no basis in material conditions or class dynamics. He could imagine solutions on paper that had no viable path to implementation in reality. Most seriously, his prejudices, particularly his anti-Semitism and misogyny, were morally indefensible and philosophically incompatible with his own stated principles. A thinker who champions universal human dignity and mutual respect cannot simultaneously advocate exterminating Jews or subordinating women. These hatreds revealed limits in Proudhon's capacity to apply his own principles consistently and undermined his claim to be a philosopher of liberation. Proudhon's influence on subsequent movements was profound, but often contrary to his intentions. He opposed revolutionary violence, but anarchist movements inspired by his ideas often embraced it. He defended individual possession against collective ownership, but later anarchists moved toward communism. He emphasized peaceful transformation, but his federalist principles were most famously implemented in the midst of revolutionary civil war in Spain. His legacy evolved in ways he would not have recognized. What does Proudhon offer contemporary readers and movements? Not a complete system to be adopted wholesale. His specific proposals have been superseded, and his prejudices must be rejected entirely. Not a perfect exemplar. His personal failings and theoretical limitations are too serious for uncritical admiration. But something perhaps more valuable, a set of questions, insights and provocations that remain relevant to current struggles. The question of how to organize complex modern economies without either capitalist exploitation or state bureaucracy remains unanswered. Proudhon's mutualism may not provide the answer, but his insistence that there must be alternatives to both markets and planning keeps the question alive. Contemporary experiments with cooperatives, platform cooperatives, participatory economics, and various forms of economic democracy are still grappling with the same tensions between coordination and autonomy that Proudhon identified. The question of how to distribute power to prevent tyranny without creating chaos remains urgent. Proudhon's federalism may not be fully practicable, but his critique of centralization and his vision of bottom-up organization offer valuable perspectives. Contemporary movements emphasizing direct democracy, horizontal organization, and distributed decision-making echo Proudhonian themes, even when participants do not know his work. The question of how to achieve social transformation against the resistance of entrenched power remains unresolved. Proudhon's faith in peaceful change proved naive, but his warning about how revolutionary violence breeds authoritarianism has been repeatedly validated by history. The dilemma between insufficient means and corrupting means that he wrestled with continues to confront revolutionary movements. Perhaps most importantly, Proudhon demonstrated the necessity of questioning all authority, including one's own assumptions and prejudices. His failure to apply this principle consistently to his own hatreds shows how difficult such questioning is, how easily we make exceptions for our own biases. But the principle itself remains valid. Authority must always justify itself. Hierarchies must always be challenged. Received wisdom must always be examined. For scholars, Proudhon offers rich material for studying the development of socialist thought, the tensions within radical movements, and the relationship between theory and practice. His massive corpus contains insights and errors in roughly equal measure, making him ideal for teaching critical engagement with political philosophy. Students can learn as much from his mistakes as from his successes. For activists and organizers, Proudhon offers inspiration and caution in equal measure. His vision of a society based on voluntary cooperation and mutual aid remains inspiring. His commitment to immediate implementation of libertarian principles, rather than postponing freedom to some future revolution, offers a valuable corrective to vanguardist approaches. But his underestimation of power and his faith in purely economic transformation without political confrontation offers lessons about what not to do. Proudhon's life and work embody the contradictions of his era and of radical thought more broadly. He was a genuine proletarian intellectual who never forgot his origins in poverty, yet he defended patriarchal family structures that oppressed working-class women. He was a visionary who imagined alternatives to capitalism and state power, yet he was a bigot who embraced ethnic hatreds. He was a rigorous thinker who identified real problems in political economy, yet he proposed solutions that could not work in practice. These contradictions do not cancel each other out, allowing us to simply average Proudhon into mediocrity. Rather, they exist in tension, creating a legacy that must be engaged with critically and selectively. We can learn from his insights about property, power, and organization while rejecting his prejudices. We can appreciate his federalist vision while recognizing that his specific mechanisms were inadequate. We can respect his intellectual courage in questioning fundamental assumptions while noting his intellectual failures in applying his principles consistently. In the history of political thought, Proudhon occupies a unique position. He was not the most rigorous theorist. Marx surpassed him analytically. He was not the most successful practitioner. His schemes largely failed. He was not the most morally admirable figure. His prejudices were abhorrent. Yet he asked questions that others ignored, opened possibilities that others could not imagine, and inspired movements that changed the world. The world Proudhon envisioned, where workers control their own labour through democratic cooperatives, where society organises itself through voluntary federation rather than state coercion, where property means possession for use rather than title to exploit, has not come to pass. A century and 3/4 after his death, capitalism and the state system remain dominant. Exploitation and domination persist. The fundamental contradictions he identified remain unresolved. Does this mean Proudhon failed completely and his ideas were worthless? That would be too simple a conclusion. Ideas do not succeed or fail solely by whether they are immediately implemented. They also succeed by changing how people think, by opening new possibilities, by inspiring continuing struggles, by providing tools for critique even when they do not provide blueprints for construction. Proudhon changed how millions of people understood property, seeing it not as natural right but as social convention that could be questioned and reorganized. He changed how people thought about government, showing that social order need not require state coercion. He changed how workers conceived of their relationship to their labour, planting seeds of ideas about workers' control that would sprout in cooperative movements, in syndicalism, in workplace democracy struggles worldwide. His failures teach lessons as important as his successes. The failure of mutual credit shows the difficulty of creating alternative economic institutions within hostile capitalist environments. The failure of his dialectical method shows the danger of treating social problems as purely logical puzzles rather than as struggles between material interests. The failure of peaceful transformation shows the resistance that power structures mount against alternatives. And his personal failures, his prejudices and blindnesses show how even radical thinkers can fail to apply their own principles consistently. 200 years after his birth, what can we say that Proudhon got right and what he got wrong? He was right that capitalism is fundamentally exploitative, that private property enables domination, that wage labour is a form of subordination. He was right that state power tends toward tyranny, that centralization concentrates power dangerously, that bureaucracy serves its own interests over those it claims to serve. He was right that workers should control their own labour, that organisation should flow from bottom to top, that freedom and equality must be implemented immediately rather than postponed to some revolutionary future. But he was wrong about how transformation could occur, underestimating the coercive power that states and capitals would deploy to preserve their dominance. He was wrong about the viability of his economic mechanisms, which proved inadequate to compete with capitalist finance and industry. He was wrong in his prejudices, which contradicted his own principles and revealed limitations in his thinking. And he was wrong in his optimism about human nature and voluntary cooperation, which ignored how power relations and material conditions shape behaviour. The task for those who would learn from Proudhon today is to extract what remains valuable while leaving behind what was mistaken or harmful. This requires critical engagement, neither uncritical celebration nor dismissive rejection, but careful sifting of insights from errors, of principles from prejudices, a vision from fantasy. Proudhon asked whether another world is possible, a world without exploitation or domination, organized through voluntary cooperation rather than coercion. His answer, mutualism and federalism implemented through peaceful transformation, proved inadequate. But the question he asked remains as urgent now as in his time. The fact that his specific answer failed does not mean the question should be abandoned. If anything, the continuing crises of capitalism and the demonstrated failures of state socialism make the search for alternatives more necessary. Pierre-Joseph Proudhon was a flawed man who developed flawed theories to address real problems. He made contributions that permanently enriched political thought and promoted prejudices that permanently stained his legacy. He inspired movements that changed millions of lives and proposed schemes that could never work. He was, in short, a human being, with all the contradictions and limitations that implies. His greatest gift to us may be precisely his contradictoriness, which prevents us from treating him as an infallible authority and forces us to think critically about his ideas. In his failures as much as his successes, in his blindness as much as his vision, Proudhon shows us the difficulty and necessity of thinking radically about how society could be organized differently. The struggle to imagine and build alternatives to exploitation and domination continues, and Proudhon's work, for all its flaws, remains part of that continuing struggle.